And it's my great privilege to welcome our honored guest this afternoon. William Jefferson Clinton served as the governor of Arkansas and then was elected as the 42nd President of the United States. He was elected twice to our nation's office, and under his leadership, the country enjoyed an enviable period of peace and economic prosperity. After leaving the White House, he established the Clinton Foundation with a global mission of strengthening economies, improving health, and protecting the environment. Along with his foundation work, he has served as the top United Nations envoy for tsunami recovery in the Indian Ocean and is the UN Special Envoy to Haiti. Today, the Clinton Foundation is supporting economic growth, capacity building, and education in Haiti and around the world. No one is better qualified to speak with us here at the John Glenn College of Public Affairs, where we place so much emphasis on the importance of leadership and public service. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage President Bill Clinton.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Wow. Thank you very much. First, President Drake, thank you for your service here at Ohio State. We first met when he was the chancellor at the University of California at Irvine, so I knew you made a good pick when he was selected. Dean Brown, thank you for your leadership at the John Glenn College. I also want to say I learned today that your Provost Joe Steinmetz has just accepted a position as the chancellor of the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. And since the Clinton School of Public Service is part of the University of Arkansas, I suppose that in some form or fashion will be working for him after the first of the year. I want to thank John and Annie Glenn for the lives they've lived, the service they've rendered, and the genuine friendship they have given to Hillary and me for longer than I can recall. I am really impressed by the program at the College of Public Affairs here, by all the various areas of emphasis, by the fact that you reach out to high school students, that you have a program to emphasize the importance of getting more women into certain public service jobs, and that there's an emphasis on doing as well as learning. In my School of Public Service, we became the only university, as far as I could tell, in the world that actually gave people a degree in public service as opposed to public policy. They're all graduate programs, but half the time has to be spent in the field, actually doing whatever your academic interest is. So I'm thrilled to be here for personal as well as public reasons. I also want to say that I admire Ohio State not only for its size and its football and basketball teams, but for its commitment to diversity and to public service generally. This is one of America's largest land-grant institutions. And since we're here to talk about public service, I think it's worth pointing out, especially after what we have been through as a country over the last 15 years and what our friends in France have been through in the last few days, that Ohio State was established under the Morrill Land Grant Act, which set aside a certain amount of land in all the American states to create public universities. That law was passed by Congress and signed by President Lincoln in 1862, in the teeth of the Civil War, when the very existence of our national union was in doubt. Abraham Lincoln and the Congress made a bet on the future. What is the lesson for today? It is very important when security is threatened and bad things are happening to try to fight against them and keep other bad things from happening, but it is never enough. Somebody has to be thinking about making good things happen and giving people something to say yes to, and giving people subject to despair and the siren calls of negative, violent, sometimes even lethal conduct, an alternative vision of the future, which is more positive, more fulfilling, more constructive. The Moral Land Grant Act led to all of us today being here in this setting, and all the students here doing what you're doing. A bet made in a dangerous time when the life of the nation was at stake and the personal security of millions of Americans at risk. A bet made on the positive side of human nature, human behavior, human aspirations. So I want to talk a little about that tonight. I don't know how late it is. It's dark in here. First, let me say something about service. Most of my life was spent in politics, and I loved it for reasons I will explain. When Hillary and I married 40 years ago, she always tells this story. It's kind of funny. She turned me down the first 2 times I asked her. And the 3rd time I asked her, I said, you know, you're probably right. Actually, you shouldn't marry me, but I want you to. She said, well, now that's an interesting sales pitch. It's a true story. She said, what's your argument? I said, well, I've got to go home to Arkansas and live. It's my life. I will disappear as a person if I don't do this. This is the life that I want to live. And I want to try to go into politics, which was crazy. None of my family had no political or financial influence. I just loved it. I like people and policy and politics. But I said, you know, I've been around the country a lot now. I think you're the most gifted person in our generation. You should go back to Illinois and run for office. And she said, that's the craziest thing I ever heard of. No one would ever vote for me. I'm just another pushy woman. I will never be voted for anything. So she came to Arkansas. And she taught me about a whole different public service. She went to work for the Children's Defense Fund when we got out of office. She was the youngest chairperson ever of the Legal Services Corporation. She brought a preschool program from Israel to our state to teach poor parents to be better teachers for their kids so they could be prepared to start school, and lots of other things, long before she was ever elected anything. Then when I got out of office and she was in office, I started my foundation. A lot of the questions today will be about that, so I won't dwell on it. But I got into this doing public good as a private citizen work at a time when it is really one of the great good news stories of the 21st century. There are 1 million plus foundations in the United States. More than half of them started in the last 20 years. And I remember one day in 2002 or 2003, I'd been out of the White House a while. I got up in the morning and I was shaving and I looked in the mirror and I thought, my God, I have become an NGO. And my whole life has changed. But that's the first point I want to make. When I think of public service today, I think it can be rendered by people in elected or appointed office, in the military, working for health and security at the state and local level, people teaching in a classroom, but it can also be rendered, and I'll give you some examples of non-governmental organizations and philanthropists and people in the very way they conduct their business. They may be advancing some overwhelming public interest. And I believe in the world we live in, every citizen's job should include some public service, because this is the most interdependent time in human history in ways that are good and bad. The bad of necessity, particularly if it's really hideous, like what happened in Paris, will always claim bigger headlines. But the trend lines show that there is a great deal of good going on in the 21st century world because of this interdependence, because of the empowerment of technology. For example, the Millennium Development Goals just expired and were replaced by these new Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations. We had more people move out of extreme poverty in the last 20 years than at any period in human history. Big drop in maternal and infant mortality. Huge gains in women's empowerment, going into business, girls going to school on equal terms with boys. The cell phone, which we all know can be an instrument of death, transferring money, planning terrorist attacks, has also probably lifted more people out of poverty and empowered more people than any device in human history. When I worked for the United Nations in Haiti after the earthquake, and we still have a permanent operation there, my foundation does, when we started, only 15% of the Haitians had access to banking. 70% of the country was living on less than $2 a day. 5 or 6 big families dominated all the financial institutions, and 20% of the country's income came from remittances. Haitians in the United States and Canada and France, in the Bahamas and the Dominican Republic primarily, just sending money home. So if you owned a bank, you could make all the money you need and then invest that money just by charging a small fee to convert the French francs to the American dollars and the Haitian gourds, and to heck with customer service. So we got the biggest cell phone company in Haiti, Digicel, run by an Irishman, to make a partnership with a Canadian bank to offer banking services to ordinary people over a cell phone, and boom, 65% of the people had banking services. Now, does that make the horror of any terrorist act go away? No. But it should remind you that you live in an interdependent world where there are good and bad forces taking advantage of the fact that borders look more like nets than walls, and the technology is empowering. Therefore, the job of every citizen who believes in freedom, democracy, peace, the rule of law, is to do something to build up the positive and reduce the negative forces of our interdependence, to maximize the upside and minimize the downside of the fact that we are condemned to share the future. The only question is, on what terms will we share it? I believe that we should be working for a future of shared opportunities, shared responsibilities, shared prosperity, and a shared sense of our common humanity, where we're proud of what differentiates us from others, but we don't have to look at others with negative reference just because they think or look or worship differently than we do. It is the great challenge of the 21st century world. We have never had such global interdependence, and yet we are bedeviled by the oldest of human conflicts rooted in identity differences. usually not as great as people think, and almost always taken advantage of by unscrupulous people who seek to gain money or power as a result of preying on people's literally age-old disposition to fear the other. The biggest job we've got before us is to figure out how to continually expand the definition of us and shrink the definition of them. Doesn't mean we shouldn't fight them when they do things that are bad. I love the headlines from France today, seeing how vigorous and effective they've been. It just means that it'll never be enough. If the borders look more like nets than walls, you have to build a world with more partners and fewer adversaries. You have to keep trying to expand the circle of cooperation and reduce the circle of conflict. And that's a big part of public service. Now, I believe, however you define your interest in service, if you want to succeed, you got to think about four things. First, you should really be interested in people as individuals. I've seen a lot of politicians who cared a lot about the world and people in the larger sense, but they couldn't relate to people individually. You should try to get over that if that's a problem for you. I was only the second person ever elected president as governor of a small state. And I'm the last president, I think, who was born in a house without a television. Although I guess President Bush was maybe 3 or 4 years old when he got a television. We were 10 when I got a television. I was 10. And I think that's the reason I became president. Because my family could never afford to take an out-of-state vacation. Till I was 15, we went to New Orleans for 3 days. And the older generation certainly couldn't. All they had was fishing and hunting, and occasional square dance came to town. Our major source of entertainment was meals, conversations at meals, storytelling at meals. And I spent a lot of my childhood with my great uncle and great aunt. And my uncle died at 91 when I was president. I went back home to the little town I was born in and spoke at his funeral. I adored him. He had a 6th grade education. I bet he had 165 IQ. But it was around that table that I learned that everybody has a story. And when I was a kid, you couldn't tell a story until first you proved you had listened to one. So I was grilled. Did you hear, Bill, what you just heard? What did you just hear? Tell me. And I would recount it. Only if I showed that I was paying attention could I then say something that happened to me that day. But it turns out it's really, really important if you want to be in public service to see the people around you. Our health and agriculture initiatives have a big presence in the Lake Country in East Africa and then south. And many people in that part of Africa, everybody walks, nobody's got a car or a wagon or anything. When they pass each other, and one says, hello, how are you, good morning, the answer, translated into English from whatever language, the Zulu term is sawubona, it means in English, I see you. Think about that. I see you. It confers dignity on people. And I was trained as a kid to see people, to believe that everybody's got a story, that they're all inherently interesting. It's just most people are too scared to tell them well. And I think about this last phase of my life in terms of stories. A 9-month-old baby I held whose parents were both dead of AIDS by the time he was in an orphanage that we supplied with children's AIDS drugs. And how now I get pictures of him every 2 or 3 years. And my daughter went back to visit in Cambodia a couple of years ago, and I've got a picture of them hugging each other. He was doomed to die, and now he's going to live a good life. That, to me, is the story of what we've tried to do in healthcare. I think of an ophthalmologist from Scranton, Pennsylvania, who joined our coalition to get rid of all the backlog of Peruvians who needed cataract surgery because of the altitude in the atmosphere, and because they work outside, they have the highest rate of cataracts among working-age people in the world. His Peruvian wife died, and he thought the only way he could honor her was to give 10 days of every month for the rest of his life to her country, providing free eye care. I could tell you 1,000 stories like that. In Kenya, or Tanzania, I met a woman we were working with in our farming program who farmed about an acre of land, and we helped her increase her income more than fourfold. She was a single mother with 7 children, and for the first time in her life, she could send them all to school. Stories around the corner or around the world. Second thing I think you have to be interested in is clarifying for yourself why in the heck you're doing what you think you want to do. That may sound self-evident, but I'll just give you a simple example. Clarity of purpose is very important in service. Suppose you volunteer to work at the local food bank. You can actually have a simple, straightforward, and entirely noble purpose. I want to gather up food and give it to people who can't afford to buy it. I don't want their kids to be hungry or malnourished. I don't want them to be hungry. I want them to know somebody in our community cares about them. That's why I do this. If that's why you do it, it will dictate a certain number of activities. Suppose you decided that you also were concerned about the fact that rates of obesity were highest among people who were closest to being hungry. Because once they got over the knife edge of being hungry, they still didn't have enough money to eat properly, and they were more likely to consume things that would be difficult for them and for their children, and that would affect the intellectual development of their children and their children's chance to escape poverty. If you believe that, it would dictate a whole different set of choices. Suppose you were concerned about not patronizing poor people, and you didn't like the way the food was being served or presented, and you thought there ought to be more of an effort to make sure that the food was attractively presented and was not presented as a welfare case, but as something to help them bridge a tough time in their life. That would change the way you behaved at the food bank. Clarity of purpose is important. The third thing that's important in service is policy. Policy really matters. It's one thing to be concerned about something, quite another to say, I think this will work. And since circumstances are constantly changing, and there are few final victories in anything relating to economic or social policy, it's important to establish not only a curious mind, but some sort of feedback loop so that you're constantly examining, re-examining, and refining what it is you wish to do. And the fourth thing that's important, if you never run for anything, is the politics of a situation. Machiavelli once said that there is nothing so difficult in all of human affairs as to change the established order of things. For those who will benefit are uncertain of their gain, while those who will lose are quite clear about their loss. I've got the scars to show for that. My point is, there's politics in everything. I remember when the Chinese government asked our health initiative to work in rural China. They had the money to buy the generic AIDS drugs, the component parts of which mostly come from China, though the medicine is mostly manufactured in India. They asked us to go out into rural China where people were contracting HIV and then full-blown AIDS and dying like flies, mostly from dirty needles and blood transfusions, because somebody had to stay behind in rural China as everybody else went to the cities to take care of the little children and the grandparents. And the Chinese, I never will forget this. I asked the health minister, I said, I'm going to come see our programs. What do you want me to do? He said, I want you to go to the biggest cities in these rural districts you're working in and be photographed on television on the floor playing with children who have AIDS and eating meals with people who have AIDS and touching them. I said, you're kidding. He said, no. He said, I know you Americans think we Chinese, because we're communists, have no politics. He said, there's politics everywhere. And everywhere, people in small towns and rural areas are more conservative, more afraid of change, more suspicious of difference than they are in more urban areas. So that's what I want you to do. So I felt like I was running for mayor of these towns in China. But it made a big difference. He said, you're well known out there. They trust you. They know you tried to have a good relationship with our country. Go show them they don't have to be afraid. So whatever you decide to do, in whatever capacity, I recommend you hone your obsessive interest in people. I recommend that you think with clarity about exactly why you're doing what you think you want to do. I recommend really being interested in policy, consulting people who know more than you do, and establishing a feedback loop so that you can change if it's warranted. And understand that there is no, you ask anybody here who's a career professor at Ohio State, you think there's no politics in the faculty? No arguments in the faculty lounge? There's politics everywhere. You got to figure out how to turn your good intentions into positive changes. And all the years I was in politics, most people talked about, look at these debates. Most people talk about, what do you want to do and how much money are you going to spend on it? Unless you're just in an insult contest, that's free. There's almost no discussion about, okay, here's what you want to do. I want to cut taxes or reform student debt and reduce the problem. That costs money. Here's how much I want to spend. How are you going to do that? How do you propose to turn your good intentions into real changes? So I recommend, particularly for you who are students, to develop a great skill at identifying and trying to answer the how question. Next point I want to make. I think one increasing component of the how answer in the 21st century will be networks, partnerships, inclusive politics, inclusive economics, inclusive society. If we could miraculously identify in this crowd the person with the highest IQ, and we took you off to a cushy room and took care of you like a newborn for 2 days, gave you whatever you wanted to eat and drink, whatever music you wanted to hear, and your IQ is 190. And the rest of us poor souls were confined to the auditorium for 2 days, eating staler and staler food, coffee that's no longer hot, And someone in the hall fed the same set of questions into us and to the genius for 2 days. Over 2 days, we'd make better decisions than the genius. Diverse groups of a considerable size make better decisions than totally homogeneous, ingrown groups, no matter how smart they are. So you have to think about inclusion. Give you my best inclusion example from politics. Nelson Mandela gave me the gift of his friendship from 1992 until he died. I was president during his entire term, and when we both got out of office, we started working on AIDS and a number of other things together. I adored him, and he was really smart. Yes, he's a great man and saintly and all that, but he was shrewd, smart, and a very good president. So anyway, we were doing some business, and I had a call scheduled one night, and I always took his calls at night because of the time difference, because I was younger and he was older and he liked to get up early and he knew I worked late, so he'd call me. 2 lessons in this call. First, people. He never called, not once, that he didn't ask about Hillary and then ask me how Chelsea was doing. And Chelsea was a little girl then. I mean, she thought Mandela was a near deity, you know. So he says, "What's Chelsea doing?" I said, "Her homework." She said, "So she's still awake?" I said, "Yeah." "Go get her." We're talking about ending their nuclear program. And he wants to go talk to my dad. And I would go get my daughter, and he'd say, "Oh, Chelsea, how are you?" She said, "Oh, Mr. President, I'm fine. I'm so glad to talk to you." He said, "Are you really doing your homework?" I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "It's very important, Chelsea." He said, "It's not good enough to be smart. You have to work. You have a lot of brain power. You owe it to yourself and to the people you will serve to develop it. And just know I'm always thinking of you and pulling for you." My daughter walks on air and stays up another hour studying. It was personal with him. Second thing, so I said, "Well, Madiba, how you doing?" He said, "Oh, I'm doing terrible." He said, "They're giving me hell now." And I said, "Who? The Afrikaners? You know, the Dutch, who were the biggest supporters of apartheid." He said, "Oh, no, my people, the ANC, they are giving me hell." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because I put the leaders of the parties that supported apartheid in my cabinet." I said, "What'd they say?" He said, "They said, you had a 19-person race, and you beat 18 people with 63% of the vote after 27 years in jail, and now you're putting these people who put you in jail, and while you were in jail, beat us up and shot us in the government? Have you lost your mind?" I said, "What'd you tell him?" He said, I asked him questions. I said, "Look, we just voted for the first time in 350 years. Can we run the banks by ourselves? How about the military? Can we manage our natural resources? Do we know enough about agriculture? Can we run the education system and the universities? Is there one thing in this whole country we can run all alone? If we'd gotten 90% of the vote, could we have done it all alone?" The answer to that is no. Now, whether we like it or not, we have to go forward together. I'm the one they put in jail for 27 years. If I can get over it, you can too. Let's go. Now we're laughing, but he did that. Helmut Kohl was the Chancellor of Germany when the Berlin Wall fell. He decided to reunite Germany. He knew it would almost certainly someday cost him his job, because the Germans in West Germany, the richest country in Europe, had to transfer funds to East Germany. And he knew he could get the worst of both worlds. That no matter how much he sent, the East Germans wouldn't catch up as fast as they wanted. And the more he sent, the madder the West Germans would be about having to do it. But he did it anyway, because he believed in inclusive politics. He reached out to Russia after the Cold War, knowing that the future of Russia was uncertain, because the Russians didn't even have enough money to bring their soldiers home from Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, much less to pay the 40,000 nuclear, chemical, and biological scientists and technicians that, if they went to work for somebody else, could cause all kinds of problems in the world. So he called me and he said, "You really need to help me with this." And with 76% of the people opposing me, in the first 4 months I was in office, organized this $24 billion aid package for Russia. And there were a few years when your tax money paid for about half the salaries of those 40,000 scientists and technologies. But it was the right thing to do. Cole knew not to take a victory dance, but to follow inclusion. And things had not gone so well with Russia in the last few years, but remember what I said. Still doesn't mean he didn't do the right thing. You don't have the luxury of permanent victories or defeats in human affairs. You decide what you believe in and go do it as best you can. And hope that you can bend, in Martin Luther King's words, the arc of history toward justice. Now, the last thing I wanted to say before we go to the questions is that I wanted to give you another example that you don't have to be in politics or even in NGO work. And the more partners you form, the better. But I'll give you an example of a company founded by a conservative Republican that I recruited to Arkansas when I was governor, Nucor Steel Mill. It's a steel mini mill. The man who founded it, who's now deceased, wrote a book about this called Plain Talk. His name is Ken Iverson. But here's the deal. When they hired you to work at Nucor, the steel mill, they had one very conservative requirement: zero tolerance for drugs. Because if you go to work stoned in a steel mill, you can kill a bunch of other people. But they told you you would never be fired, except for misconduct. They had a no layoff policy. Your base pay was only 65 to 70% of the base pay of workers in traditional steel mills in Pennsylvania. But you got a weekly bonus. So the average income every year was 150 to 200% of what others were making. The workers got the bonus. They had a profit sharing plan that applied only to the bottom 90% of the workers. Then they had an education supplement that started out as basically the equivalent of tuition aid for the children of the workers, that today includes all the spouses and the workers themselves. Stunning. So they organized a system to do just what the American economy doesn't do. Every increase in productivity and income they got was disproportionately shared with their employees. Top management wasn't in profit sharing. They didn't have a central office. They didn't have guaranteed parking places. They didn't own a corporate jet. The guy who founded the company said, "This company is 60% people, 40% technology. The rest of us are here to make sure the people in the technology succeed." He did a public service by proving that you can make money in a competitive economy without saying it's the shareholders here and the employees and the customers and the communities here. So when someone tells you the world as it is and as it has been now for 15 years can't be changed, it's not true. I'll give you another example. I just was at a company founded by a friend of mine. It's a real estate development company. More than half the board members are women. The company is diverse. It's a Canadian company. And half of every employee's compensation is based on how well they do in the job they were hired to do. The other half is based on how well they relate to the other employees and reflect the values of cooperation and inclusion of the company. And we had all night, I could give you more. The point is, there are many ways to render service. The public and private pension funds of many unions decided to stop feeling victimized and start taking action in a way that would create jobs for other unions that had weaker pension funds, mostly building trades unions. They committed $14.6 billion to retrofitting and building efficient buildings at our Clinton Global Initiative, the largest private infrastructure bank in America. They spent something over $6 billion of that. They've already created well over 50,000 jobs. Instead of just being political and arguing for this, that, or the other policy, or fighting with the management within certain companies or certain public entities, they said, hey, we can make good money off infrastructure. Our pension funds need diversified investments. We won't be paying a fortune for somebody to invest our money, and we'll hire our brothers and sisters and strengthen their work and their ability to pay their pension liabilities without wrecking their operation. There are so many ways to be creative in public service. Last point. The ultimate lesson of the interdependent world is that the cooperators will prevail in the end. Most important political book I've read in 3 or 4 years was written by a Nobel Prize winning microbiologist named E.O. Wilson, who's now nearly 90. He was a mere 83 when he wrote the book. It's called The Social Conquest of Earth. It's about 240 pages long. And in it, Wilson, insofar as the evidence will permit, traces the history of all life on planet Earth from the emergence of single-cell organisms out of the primordial slime down to the current day. And he says if you look at all the species that ever existed on our planet, the most successful ones, if you define success as persistence in the face of a zillion things that could have wiped them out, are ants, termites, bees, and people. The combined weight of all ants on Earth exceeds the combined weight of all people on Earth. Did you know that? There are ants that, when being chased by predators, some of them will just go up on the tallest blade of glass and sacrifice themselves so that the rest get away. In South America, there are termite species that, in hot climates, build air-conditioned housing below the ground, drilling 5 holes. Only one will they go in and out of, the other 4 for air conditioning. And when it's going to rain, they don't go at all. The patterns of bees are legendary. Wilson says now people are the most interesting case because unlike ants, termites, and bees, they have consciousness and conscience, which means our capacity for cooperation is far greater than any species. But we're also prone to arrogance, so we keep moving up right to the edge of destruction and pulling back. And Wilson has always been like a Chicken Little, telling us how many species we're destroying. Even in the book, he reminds us that we're destroying species at the most rapid rate in 10,000 years. But he said, in the end, I'm betting on people. I'm an old man now, but I'm very optimistic about the future because I think our consciousness will evolve to favor cooperation over conflict. But the future belongs to the cooperators. So I will say again, whatever you decide to do in service, remember this. We are condemned to share the future. No one can stop virtual and actual walls from increasingly looking more like nets. We are going to share the future. The only question open for debate are the terms upon which we will share it. Those of you who are best at public service will have the most influence on what those terms are and what the world looks like for children and grandchildren. Good luck and thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, President Clinton, for sharing your thoughts with us. We have a special treat. President Clinton's time is tight, but he's been gracious enough to allow a former student, someone who loves to learn and continues to learn, in Senator Glenn to ask him a couple of questions. So, Senator Glenn, fire away.
Well, thank you. First, thank you very much for being here today with us and helping kick off our beginning of our college. And we appreciate that very, very much, and for the generosity of your time and for your remarks. We appreciate it more than I can say. Well, I was wondering, and the only thing, Annie and I have been fortunate enough to be your guests several times at the Clinton Global Initiative in New York. And that's been a real experience each time because it's amazing. I think that the Clinton Global Initiative is the most successful non-government organization that I've known in my lifetime. That really has been outstanding. And I would just like a couple of comments from you on how you picked that. It actually took some of the areas where the disease was rampant in Africa and took that on and really cured that. And the enormity of the jobs that you took on were something. And I would, if you could make a couple of comments on that, I'd appreciate it very much. I know there's more than we're going to be able to cover tonight, and your time is short, but
I'm fine.
I'd appreciate it very much.
My foundation basically had 3 very large programs and then a host of others that I think are really important that either will become large or I'll give them to somebody else. That as I either try to do something I think we can have a big impact on, or something that I think is important that I'll try to find an answer for that I'll hand off to somebody else with more money. But the Clinton Global Initiative is special to me because one day, about 11 years ago, one of the young people who worked for me said, you know, you keep going to Davos, to the World Economic Forum and giving these speeches, and we ought to do one at the opening of the UN in New York. And I said, well, I'll do it, but only if we don't do anything. We're not like Davos. He said, what do you mean? I said, I'm tired of going to meetings where really smart people say really intelligent things and nobody ever promises to do anything. So let's have a meeting where we tell people on the front end they can come this year, but we won't let them come back unless they promise to do something about all these things they care about. Talk about a dumb idea. We were going to charge money for people to choke in New York traffic during the UN so they could spend more money or time or effort to solve a social problem. That's what we did. And we invited the world leaders to come, and then we comp a lot of non-governmental organizations in America and around the world, and in poor countries we even fly them in. And so they work together and make commitments. And after 11 years, we can, I've actually had Palantir, a company a lot of you know about, the big data company, analyze our commitments, and they believe 81% of them either have been or will soon be completely kept. Many of them are multi-year commitments. And we can document 430 million people in 180 countries whose lives have been changed for the better. And when all these commitments are implemented, they'll be worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $87 billion. And they just did it. I'll give you one of my favorite examples. Not this year, but last year when we met in September, the Ebola epidemic was raging, and it had just broken out. And the international community hadn't really organized a response. So one of our partners is a great medical service company called Becton Dickinson. And Gary Cohen, representing them, with our help, we put together more than a dozen other partners, and we opened the global initiative by saying we were sending the first 100 tons of medical equipment to Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. Eventually, they sent 500 tons, all volunteer. No government money, no tax money, no nothing. They did it together. And to me, it proves what I'm saying. Networks work well. And it's thrilling to me, but that's what we do. And I hope that we'll be able to keep doing it, or that we'll get put out of business. You'd be amazed now how many meetings there are where they at least have one or two people make a commitment to actually do something when they're talking about something. None of that existed 10 years ago, and I'd like to see it become a regular feature of all discussions of public problems.
Senator Clinton, do you have another? Senator Glenn? Senator, have you got another question?
No, I think you've been so generous with your time here. I think the Clinton Global Initiative to me has been one of the best of the non-governmental organizations I've seen ever. And we need more of that kind of using that as a demonstration of how great things can be, because you took whole areas of disease that were literally wiping out populations and were able to reverse those trends. And what a job that was. So thank you so much, and thank you again for today. This has been great, and appreciate your coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Can I say something to the students here? The one thing I'd like to say to all of you is, even though those numbers sound pretty big, and the biggest foundation in the world is the Gates Foundation, also one of the 2 or 3 best. They're unbelievably good at what they do. There are a lot of things you can do. We have a global initiative for university students every year. I'll just give you one example. And a few years ago, this student who was from Africa was really upset that more than a quarter of all the drugs that were coming into his country and other poor countries were adulterated, basically were no good. So he developed an app so that we could set up a system using the internet and cell phones essentially to check the validity of these drugs. It was called Sproxel. It recently sold for something like $500 million. And he didn't do it for the money. He did it because he wanted to save lives. So I think it's the aggregate that matters. We've got a working group that's raised through the Global Initiative a total, when it's all invested, only about 160 million has been invested, but these just people have committed to spend more than $400 million in Haiti to help make it a more modern economy and create decent jobs for people. So that's what I'd urge you to think about. The leverage you get out of the internet permits us all to have influence beyond our wildest dreams. You don't have to make bombs. And you don't have to target people. You can build dreams. And I hope you'll all do that.
You're going to give that,
President Clinton,